So today we're here with a bunch of cool people that I'm excited to talk to. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I think a lot of people have mentioned on Twitter, and they have differing opinions on this. And the topic is remote work. And there's been a few tweets going around about whether the future is remote or the future is not remote. And so the purpose of this conversation is to bring some of the top minds in the space who've been thinking about this for a while, and just to have a conversation and debate about what are the pros and cons of going remote, and where does it make sense and where does it not make sense, and what types of things do we need to still do to make remote more easy, or is it just not even worth trying to do that? All those types of things are what we're going to talk about today. And I kind of want to start off by saying that fundamentally, I don't believe there's a right or wrong answer in this. So you're not going to walk away with like a silver bullet answer to how to run your team or whether you do remote or not. I think it's very contextual. So things like the stage of your company. Are you just starting out and trying to build a founding team, or are you more at a growth stage? Things like what industry your company might be in. Are you in tech or are you in manufacturing? You can argue that a manufacturing company is likely not going to go all remote. Other things that matter are like the role. You might argue that an engineer could do something remotely, but maybe someone who needs to be in the office and coordinate a lot that can't do remote roles. And then the last thing I think will matter a lot is like location. Sometimes you have access to talent, and sometimes you're living in locations that don't have the same level of access. So all these things will come into play. So I think we're going to have that conversation in depth today and talk about some of the pros and cons of going remote. And I know different people in this room have different opinions about how extreme they feel about remote being the future. Personal anecdote, I will say that I was 100% in the remote camp. So I know Jeff feels strongly about remote, and Andreas feels strongly about remote, and I was similar in that boat. And I kind of recently switched my stance on this after starting TruStory, and I'll get into that in this debate. But before that, I want to just go and do a quick round of introductions so everyone's familiar with who's on the call. Andreas?
Sure, I can start. So hi, Andreas. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to join you guys in this discussion. My background is I was founding team and CTO of a company called Product Hunt, a fully distributed team in. We have like people from India to America, like pretty much everywhere. And we were acquired by AngelList a few years back, and now I'm leading anything related to global hiring, remote work at AngelList. So basically trying to help people find remote work globally.
Awesome. Jeff?
Cool. Jeff, I'm in LA. I think there's two of us in LA on this call. So, but I am the director of product and revenue at Tinder, investor in some remote companies. Turing.com is a recent one, invested in Lambda School, longtime user of Upwork, and have hired amazing engineers, designers all throughout the world. So I do strongly believe in remote work.
Awesome. Arianna?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. So my name is Arianna Simpson. I run a crypto fund called ASP and a VC fund called Crystal Towers Capital. I've invested in a lot of companies, most of which are not remote, although some of them have some remote teams. And in general, I am on the slightly anti-remote camp.
Okay, so in this debate, me and Arianna are kind of on one side. We are not remote, anti-remote, quote unquote, and then Jeff and Andreas are pro-remote. So I kind of want to start with the pro-remote side, because I think there's obvious benefits to remote that we can all agree with. And so Andreas, and maybe Andreas can start and talk about like, what do you think are the biggest pros to remote? And then we can start going into that.
Sure. So it starts off like, personally, I don't think that in the future we'll have a discussion about remote work or not remote work. I think it will just become work, and it won't be like a binary thing, yes or no. It will be just a question of how much. And I think everybody here is already a remote worker. The only question is like how much of their day they actually work remote. So I think this will be like more like on a scale thing. Like for me, the biggest advantages are I'm able to hire the people I want to hire. versus I'm able to hire the people that happen to live around me. That's one. The number two is I can optimize my day for my own performance. So I don't have to worry about FaceTime in the office and all this kind of stuff. I don't have to worry about Sally looking at me that I come in at 1 p.m. I can just like optimize my day for myself, which is interesting, especially when you like get older and maybe have a family and all this kind of stuff. But also like when you're younger, for example, I prefer to go to the gym at a certain time. This is no problem when I work remote. And third big advantage for me personally is retention. A lot of remote teams, like in San Francisco, it's kind of common to have an engineer for, let's say, 1.5 years, maybe 2. And that's already like the default normal. I know a lot of remote teams that have people since half a decade, 1 decade. So I think retention becomes like a huge advantage in the long run to teams, because you don't constantly have a brain drain, like losing people, like losing your most important people constantly. So I think these are the 3 biggest advantages from my personal point of view.
Interesting. I have something to say about the retention thing, but before I get into that, Jeff, do you want to talk about why you are so pro remote?
Yeah, so I think I felt this. I've been a part of a founding team in a company in Kansas City. I'm now in LA, and I just see the talent gaps in certain locations. I think about remote work less on a personal level, more just in terms of hiring and kind of labor arbitrage. I've talked to a lot of early stage startups who, the minute they announce they're a remote company or list a job that's remote, all of a sudden they're flooded with applications. So you see like this is a desired lifestyle amongst tech employees at this point. We can talk about San Francisco in detail and why that's becoming a less desirable place to live. But to me, it's unlocking a group of people who aren't currently in San Francisco, and it's as mentioned, if you hire someone in LA, you do see much greater retention. I don't have exact data to prove that today, but I just know there's less companies in LA, so you see much less movement. So I think there's a retention angle too.
Super interesting. I never actually thought about the retention angle. And I think it's very location based, like you said, because I would have assumed one of my biggest reasons for flipping my stance on remote versus non-remote, because personally when I was working at Coinbase or A16Z, I really did enjoy having that remote option. Like there were a few days of the week where I can just zone in and work from home. And I used to be like, okay, like everyone should just be remote. Like this is so much more productive. But then when you're building a team, especially from ground up, 0 to 1, I realized that like everyone being in the office and that level of accountability that you have to your teammates, because you see each other, you feel each other, that level of accountability is really hard to get in a fully remote setting. And so I almost felt that the retention would be lower if it was remote, because you don't feel the same level of connection to your team, at least at this early stage where it's just like 5, 10, 15 of us. And I can kind of move jobs anytime or work even 2 jobs if I'm working remotely. Whereas like if you're working for one company and you have to show up every day, then like you feel a level of commitment and to your team. And so you have a greater retention. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Can I add something to this?
Yeah.
What you saying like strikes a nerve with me. I usually call this like systemization of trust. Like you actively have to think about trust, where if you're like in the same office, you can worst case walk behind somebody and just like casually look at their laptop and see like, is it like a code editor or is it like YouTube, not necessarily meaning that they're actually productive or they're really doing something, but you have a little bit of like this feeling that you're more in control, right? And trust is something you have to actively think about when you are in a remote team, and that's super hard. And I still struggle doing this doing this well, figuring out like what kind of decisions do I pass on? How do I judge the work of somebody else? Is this like I had engineers that were as effective as anybody else in a team, but I was pretty sure if they would like really try harder, they could achieve more, right? But like, how do you systemize this? How do you think about this? How do you validate this? I think this is not problems that are unique to remote. I think you have this in any team, especially when it gets bigger. I just think that it's more explicit in a remote team. As many like problems you have in management of knowledge workers, they just become more explicit if you're working in a remote setup. So yeah.
And like like especially when like trust is something that I think humans build, especially when there's like a human level, like a human's touch element to it. And I just don't understand how you build that level of trust purely when you're staring at avatars, just to be blunt.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in and take the counterpoint. I think the argument that I've heard from companies who do this is that they often do have, like quarterly on sites or off sites or something where they do get everybody in the same place, because I think that's something that is very real. I think you kind of to piggyback what was said earlier, I think you kind of also have to consider whether you're talking about like fully remote teams or not. I think one of the things that I've seen not work well is if you have part of the team that's remote and part of the team that's not, the people who are remote end up feeling kind of like second class citizens. They're often passed over for promotions. They are kind of feel disengaged. Oftentimes decisions are made kind of on the spur of the moment or like by the water cooler. And so they don't really get a say in those things because not everything is communicated online. And there are definitely ways to kind of compensate for that. I know some companies that have a lot of remote people, like literally no decisions can be made, no meetings can happen unless everybody, including remote people, are in the room or things like that. But in general, I think that's really hard to do. And, I could see a case for why that would slow decision making down, because you kind of have to make everything a little bit more scripted. And that's not necessarily ideal especially if you're a startup in the earliest stages.
Yeah, like the half remote, like how dedicated you are to remote versus trying out remote and not putting everything behind it. I think that makes a huge difference, because it's like there's no way that like a person that's coming in the office and you have a team there doesn't feel different than someone who's abstracted away from that physical presence. And I think like I've definitely heard companies do the whole you either like there's one company, for example, HashiCorp, where I think they're fully remote and they don't even let employees like meet each other to talk about work, because they feel that's an unfair advantage to other people who don't get to do that and don't get to have that level of collaboration. So what I've also heard is like if you're going remote, you have to like go fully remote, like everyone has to do it or everyone doesn't have to do it.
Can I just to add to this, like I know for a fact that this is more like a legend that because I met people in coffee working together from HashiCorp. Yeah. So okay. I think this is more like an urban myth that try to promote to show how amazing they are, right? So yeah.
Interesting. And then the talent arbitrage thing, I think that's probably the most interesting part of this whole discussion, because that is hard to deny. Even for me, like we've been very adamant about building the core team in LA. But with our community, for example, we have people from all over the world, like Thailand, Zimbabwe, India, God, like there's like probably 14 countries of people in the community. And like, it's kind of really cool that they all get to participate in this, and that would never be possible if they had to be physically present. So that's one huge advantage that you can argue could trump all the other disadvantages. But I'm curious to hear, Jeff, like, how do you reconcile some of the disadvantages that come with remote?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to also think about the stage of the company we're talking about. Yeah. So, if you're setting up remote with a 10-person team, a lot easier than when you have 500 employees like Tinder. But I guess I'll talk about the advantages quickly first. When you're an early stage company and you raise, say, a couple $1 million and you have some key hires to make, do you really want to spend a couple $100,000 on an employee in San Francisco, an engineer? And if you want to build out a full stack team, say you're building iOS, Android, and web, suddenly your engineering team is probably 10 plus people. Then you have marketing and you have everybody else. It's just not financially responsible to be building an early stage company in San Francisco without considering remote. Is as an investor, when I hear someone talk about being remote, it makes me feel like they're being fiscally more responsible. And so that's another angle. We could talk about the financial advantages too. I think the disadvantages are, and I've done a lot of research. I'm doing my thesis on Lambda Score right now, who has a remote component to their work, is a lot of remote teams tend to be disregarded by the core team. And in that, as you mentioned, there's less opportunity for promotion, etc. And you're kind of made to feel like outsiders almost. And this is scientifically proven. Like if you're not next to someone in an office, you tend to discard them often in terms of how you think of them. And so those are the concerns. I don't think I have all the answers. I think we should probably bring on like Wade Foster from Zapier or someone like that. But I think what I've heard is they try and artificially create kind of spontaneous communication. So once a week, you spend 30 minutes having a virtual coffee chat with a coworker who you've never met, and so that's set up automatically. So you're getting kind of the water cooler conversation without necessarily being in the same room. And then Arianna mentioned they do I think quarterly meetups is their cadence, but there's an element of offsite meetups to facilitate the in-person engagement that you get at any other office.
Like I find it interesting that you mentioned that it's easier to do remote early stage than late stage, because I would have personally thought it was flipped. Again, mostly because I'm looking at this from like trying to build a company, trying to go from 0 to 1 and not 1 to 100. And like at that phase, like building a really cohesive team is super important. And I almost feel like if you did it remote, there's too many disadvantages to it. Like there's too many risks involved where, like, again, it comes back to that trust and how cohesive the team can really get if they're fully remote. And I could be totally wrong about this, but that's kind of where my personal hesitation is. Like if I had to build TruStory all over again, I don't think I would do remote despite all the advantages, just because of this trust and cohesiveness that I find that we have as a team, that we get to show up every day and we're like super passionate about this. And I don't know how you get that in a fully remote setting.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's one of the big things that I've seen as well. It's that, so much of startup success is kind of intangibles, and you get this kind of shared mission and shared purpose. And, I'm not trying to say that remote companies don't have a shared mission, but I think it is really much easier to get everyone on the same page in terms of the enthusiasm and kind of the drive towards whatever it is that you're working on. And startups are so hard that if you don't have that, you're just kind of, I think, putting yourself at a natural disadvantage. There are so many disadvantages that startups already have that, it's just kind of hard to add to that. The thing is, that's also very hard to measure. So, I don't really have a lot of metrics that I can point to in the sense that, how do you measure enthusiasm or things like that? I guess you can do engagement surveys or things like of that sort. But in general, I think, the shared mission, shared purpose, especially in the early days, is super important. And it's really tough to get that if you don't, if you're not in the same place.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't, like, there's so many times at the company where just like being able to watch each other's micro expressions, sometimes things get misinterpreted in Slack, and it's like the personalities that you develop in Slack can often be very different than the personalities that you have in person. And so I've noticed that like sometimes like something that might seem like a heated conversation in Slack just completely disintegrates as soon as we meet up in person and kind of just like hash it out in a minute. And
tone is really hard.
Tone is really hard. And I guess maybe this comes down to what, Jeff, you were saying about the future is remote, but we don't have the tools to make it really amazing yet, right?
I agree. I think so. On the shared mission piece, like it really comes down to the company you're building. I know I'm talking about Lambda a lot, but if you're building a mission-oriented company at its core, I think it's a lot easier than something like a photo sharing app. Like I think there's some company missions that are easier to build remotely. So that's one element. In terms of just like the communication piece, I agree. Like I manage multiple remote employees right now, and there are challenges that come with it. A lot of it I put on myself to be the one who make sure I'm initiating the conversations and kind of keeping in touch. But I've seen people, we have one of those robots in our office that kind of like goes around the office and has a live video camera. I'm forgetting the name of it now. But you know, that's fun and all, but it doesn't replace in-person conversations. I've seen a lot of people who have, one of my companies, we had an always on TV. Again, like you kind of walk past and you wave your hand a little bit, and it's a little bit awkward, but also fun. That doesn't replace it either. So I agree that there are challenges, but I think if you look at the positives, you know, trying to build a company that way is a really interesting possibility.
To add on this, like I fully echo what was said before. It's kind of scary, for example, like in an early stage startup when you need to pivot. For example, like you're doing something and this doesn't really work and you need to pivot, and you're like, let's say the product manager or the founder, and all of a sudden you kind of feel alone. Like you feel like you're the only person really worrying about this because you don't see the other people worrying about it, right? And you can like write in Slack, hey, this is like a problem, we need to discuss this, and then you have a meeting. And then again, you're like alone, right, afterwards. So this is super scary. And I agree, there's a lot of nuance lost in Slack. Absolutely. In any kind of, like even here in this, like if this would be in person, it would be completely different, right? I personally believe in person is better for innovation. So if you need to discuss something where you, like subtleties are really, really important, and you have like, for example, a meeting with like 10 people and there are like some really shy people in there who wouldn't speak in a 1 hour long hangout, right? That's easier in person. This is something where a lot of remote teams just get together. Like if you have to do a major pivot, like either the whole company or at least this team just flies to the same location and discuss it, right? This is what I would recommend. On the other hand, I strongly believe that iteration is better remote. Like if I know what to do and I have like the means to make decisions and I have the means to like just move, I can move by far faster remote. And I know a lot of people who just optimize their performance a lot better remote, but like multitudes better. One pattern I noticed is a lot of the more famous remote teams have their founders in the same city or at least in the same region. So that at least the founders can like regularly meet and like discuss like anything that's a little bit more like subtle, right? That's a very common pattern I noticed. But I fully agree. Like all these things mentioned, like for example, if you need to pivot, that's scary. And if you like at that moment feel like you're like the only person really worrying about this is like you feel alone, and this is like a super stressful moment. So like my suggestion on this kind of part is don't consider it binary. Like just because we now talk in a hangout doesn't mean we will never meet in person, right? Just because we are not in the same city doesn't mean we cannot like meet in the same city and all this kind of stuff. Like not treating this binary.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, to your point about like needing people to be in the same place for certain moments, I think that's why my preferred method is to have not an open office floor plan. And I think things like that, which seem trivial, are actually important. So, you know, when you know what you need to go and do, obviously it's very distracting if you have people around all the time, they're talking. Like, I hate open office floor plans because I can't get anything done. But I think like if you know, you can have an office where you have people in the same place, but then you also have places where people can like kind of work quietly and not be interrupted. That to me is the best model because, you know, to your point, saying that innovation happens better in person. I mean, what are startups if not innovative? Like, so to me, that's not like, oh, we're going to get together and we're going to innovate for 2 hours and then like see you guys next month. Like, this is kind of a constant iterative process, which requires innovation throughout the whole thing or through a majority of it, which is why, you know, I think if you do that, if you say, oh, we're all going to go away and just do the work and then we're going to come back, that I think is very antithetical to this idea of like, you know, rapid iteration, like figuring, you can't just like go away, decide what you're going to build, go away, build it in a vacuum, then come back and talk about it. Like, I think it's a lot more interactive than that. And so if you do that, then you're going to end up with a product that like maybe not what your customers want, maybe not what you're, you know, what you're actually trying to build. And so to me, it's less of a binary, oh, now we're going to innovate and then later we're not, we're just going to build it, and more of kind of an ongoing process.
Just to clarify this aspect here, with innovation, I don't mean like we do something innovative. I mean radical shifts in what you do. Like if you need to completely pivot your company, like this kind of like more like in the classical sense of innovation, like in the sense of like there's iterative innovation and there is innovative innovation, in the sense of like this is a massive jump to something completely else, or we already know we're doing a photo sharing app, or we already know we're doing like an education startup, and now we like iterate on like what exactly it will be, how the brand will be, what the product will be. Like that's just to clarify what I meant.
But I would argue that like you never know what exactly something is going to be, and to Arianna's point, like it's constant iteration, at least until a certain stage. Like if I like going innovating and then going in a vacuum, innovating, going in a vacuum, that slows you down. And I think I've noticed this, for example, in the crypto space where every project is remote, or at least like 90% of the teams are remote and global. And you, as a result, you see that the progress on these projects is really slow. And it's not because they're not competent. It's because I think like for them to get in a room together and decide, like even sometimes trivial decisions takes weeks or months. And I don't really understand. I think like the huge advantage to being in person is that you can move a lot faster because you're looking at each other in the face, and like you're able to communicate that much faster. And at a startup, like speed of iteration is like one of the core things. And so that's where that's also another big downside that I see to going remote at this stage.
Yeah, I guess I definitely agree with that. I think Andreas mentioned something earlier, which was really interesting. It's kind of the model that works for distributed, which I'm seeing is a core founding team in San Francisco, New York, LA, wherever you need to be, and they're together, and then you can hire ICs outside of your core area, and that does seem to work pretty well because you have the larger strategic conversations happening. There's a sense of shared purpose amongst kind of the management team, and then you have ICs who are happily living wherever they want to be. So I think that's also a really good model to look at.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Like we actually just did that. We made our first 2 remote engineering hires, and that was after our core team was kind of built. And one is in Guatemala, one is in India, and it's incredible to have them. But I can't, like, again, like if it was them 2 starting out with, like we wouldn't have the core team that we have today. So the whole model around ICs being remote is definitely something I'm supportive of and not against.
But then again, it's like, are you hiring someone who is like being brought on to basically like execute a specific function that you tell them exactly what it is? Or are you hiring someone who's supposed to be like a core contributor to whatever it is you're building? Because like, I think if you think of people as kind of like modular components that can be phased in and out and just execute a narrow task, then like, well, I mean, that's not generally how I think of people, but I think there are situations in which maybe that does apply. But if you want them to be kind of contributing, not just executing, but actually thinking through like, not just do this task, but like, does this task make sense? Are we building the right thing? Then it starts to become a lot more difficult, because it's like, also, I mean, I guess it depends. Like for some people that would work. Like speaking for myself, I could never do that. Like that sounds horrible to me. Someone makes decisions somewhere else and then they're like, here, do this thing. Like I would jump out a window. Like, so you're going to have, you will be able to hire, but you're going to hire a very specific kind of person, which may be fine for what you need again, but it's important to be aware of that, because I think a lot of people would be miserable. And then I also think and again, this very much depends on what functions you're trying to hire for, but I would guess that remote companies are generally pretty heavily skewed anti-extrovert. So like, I don't know, what are the implications of that? I'm not sure. I don't think we really have enough data on that to really know, but I think that's something that's pretty real. I mean, maybe someone in a sales function is still interacting with people outside the company enough, but I think a lot of people who are extroverts and like having coworkers would probably not be super happy in a role like that. So, what are
Just
the
to
effects of that? I'm not sure.
Hey,
just to
Arianna, do you want to talk about your tweet that just lit Twitter on fire about remote work?
can I,
Well, I mean, that was what sparked the conversation, I guess, to some extent. Yeah, I mean, my tweet was basically just that I said I think most remote work is bullshit. And hilariously enough, I have now recorded 2 podcasts about it, both which will be released shortly, and we're having this conversation. So people will know far more than they ever thought they could about my thoughts on remote work in the near future. But in general, I think well, first of all, I was a bit flippant, and obviously Twitter is not the best place for nuance. So some of that always gets lost. But my point was really just that and again, here's the nuance piece not being there. I was thinking about early stage tech startups. So there's all kinds of businesses, lifestyle businesses, this, that, and the other thing, which shouldn't, which would be totally fine remote, would arguably be much better remote and things like that. So I want to caveat that I was thinking about a very specific kind of company. The issue is, like, at the end of the day, it's very hard to have data in either direction, right? Because of course some people were super pro, some people were super anti. And a lot of folks took it so personally, which frankly shocked me. They were like, basically acted as if I had insulted them personally. And I was like, okay, this is not at you, calm down. But in general, I think, it's hard to have data. And the issue there is people are like, well, Envision is remote and they're successful. And I'm like, yeah, but like, who knows? Maybe they would have been 5 times bigger if they'd all been in the same place, right? So it's really hard to predict what the outcomes would have been in either direction. So I don't think we have, perfect answers around any of that.
I would quickly love to answer, get back to what you said before regarding hiring executors. So just to make sure I'm not misunderstood, when I think, I strongly agree tech startups are heavy in innovation in the beginning and they're heavy innovation later on, and it's one of the core principles. And I didn't mean with in person is better for innovation and remote is better for iteration, that for me, this means radical pivots. If I completely, either we shut down this company or we completely pivot what we do, this is a discussion I have in person and not in Slack. This is a discussion I want to have in person. This is by far better in person. And everything else is usually on a slider, and usually it's completely fine. You can easily iterate, and you can easily iterate to success remote. The other thing regarding hiring executors, I think this is a misunderstanding of knowledge management. You don't tell people what to do, at least not good knowledge workers. This is not how you, in my experience, remote workers are usually have more autonomy and are more capable of making their own decisions than people in an office, at least the ones I'm in my personal experience, because you need to, any decision I need to run by you if I'm remote, that slows everybody down. If I can make this decision on my own, and if I'm capable of making this decision on my own, if I have all the tools I need to make this decision on my own, if I know where we want to go, it's more can I make decisions on my own, the faster I can iterate remote. So in my experience, good remote teams actually skew to the other extreme. They enable their people to be as autonomous as possible and actually hire people that don't want to be blind executors. They don't want this office drone, just tell me what to do and I will do it. But the exact opposite. They want somebody, hey, give me a problem, I will solve it kind of people.
I will say, I think, and this is, related to what you just mentioned, Andreas. I'm sure I'm going to get lots of hate mail for this, but I think a lot of it comes down to people don't want to fucking be in the office because it sucks. And not always, but often. And people want to be able to be oh, I'm working from Tulum for the week, whatever. Nobody knows, right? At the end of the day, I don't think that's what's going to deliver the best work product. But the thing is, people in many cases, I think argue for that because it's preferable. And so I think that's why people get very, people want to be autonomous, as you said. They want to be kind of more free. And I think in general that is one of the results of working remotely. But it ends up being not necessarily, I think it's unpleasant to be told that you have to be somewhere at a certain time. And so that's where a lot of the pushback comes, not necessarily because people have because it's actually better to be remote, but just because people don't want to be in the office. And
Yeah.
like, that's a very unpopular thing to say. And like I said, I'm sure I'll get lots of darts thrown at me for it, but like, whatever, YOLO.
I don't think that's controversial at all. I think we can all agree, especially if you're
Oh my gosh, go read my Twitter mentions after that tweet. I assure you it's very controversial. Seriously.
I mean, especially if you're an introvert, like I don't think anyone can disagree that like being zoned in, like sitting on your couch or your bed, wherever you work best, like you kind of get a lot of work done when you do that. So it's hard to deny that part. And being in Tulum and getting to do work, like that's great. But that element is exactly what you almost don't want, is what I'm trying to say, for an early stage startup, where you do want that commitment to the team, where you do want that accountability of showing up to work and not just being in Tulum one weekend because you felt like it. Not like, and like it's interesting because like my perspective on this shifted again. Like when I was just an employee per se, like I was like, oh, this is like the future, like this is how everything should be. And perhaps it was because I didn't really have an attachment to my team as much as I do now. Whereas like now I just feel such a close connection to my team, and I cannot envision us doing this like in different parts of the world.
So let's make this full-on Fox News panel. I fully disagree. So if any of my employees would just randomly jump to Tulum and work with shitty internet from the beach without announcing it, and like during a heated phase of the company, you fire that person, period. I also don't believe that, like I usually recommend not working from home if you work from remote. Like I think this leads to a lot of problems. Like a lot of people become like lonely. A lot of people have like bad balance between when they work, when they not work, and tend to be like less efficient because of that. A lot of people have problems doing it and just like creating a boundary between their private life and their work life. Some people manage it really well, but like if you have problems, don't do it. What I usually recommend is like rent a desk in a small office in your city with for example, other engineers, ideally like other engineers who also work remote. So this is number one. Number two is in every remote team, you need to commit on times you work, and you need to be responsive in these times. And usually it's actually the other way around, that you are kind of implicitly expected to even be responsive outside of that time because other people maybe have a problem like late at night, So it's even more a little bit on the extreme side. And definitely like don't work from anywhere where you're not productive. Like if you travel and work, usually the first week you're not productive. Like after like 2 weeks at the same spot, you start being productive. And if you travel to Tulum, and everybody here knows how horrible the Wi-Fi is at Tulum, like forget working. Like might as well lay on the beach and enjoy being fired, right?
Yeah, and like another interesting angle to look at this is like loneliness. Especially in the modern world where people are already very lonely because of social media addiction, et cetera, anxiety. Like the loneliness part is also a huge thing. Like when you're working, when I started the company, for example, the first 3 or 4 months were just in my house, and it got really lonely. Like I at some point just needed human connection, and I know that people supplement this by going to cafes or WeWorks. But like, how does this become a global phenomenon without becoming an issue?
Jeff, do you want to add this? Like my answer is don't work from home. Like rent a small office with people you actually like, work from there, period.
Yeah, I think there's how many WeWorks in New York at this point? Like 30 WeWorks. There's co-working spaces on every street corner. I think one question is that supported by the company in terms of like, are you as an employee financially responsible for renting that desk? Because it's effectively another office space. But I think that's right. Like, you need to get outside and be around people who are conquering similar challenges. So, I tried to be a screenwriter when I was 22, and I worked from home, and I was a lost soul for like a year and a half. So it's I would not recommend sitting at home working alone all day. It can be a very lonely thing.
And the one other thing that came up during there's a bunch of questions that are coming through, but like one of the things that they talked about was trust and accountability. Andreas, like how do you, again, like can you reiterate, like how do you build that in a remote setting? Because it's obvious to most of us how that happens when you're all sitting in one office. But how do you make sure that the team trusts each other and has accountability? Like what are the tools you use? What are the processes that you use to make that happen?
I would challenge you. Like, I don't think people in an office know how to establish trust. I think they monkey patch it with micromanaging, or they monkey patch it with meetings. Like, let's have a random meeting, let's have another random meeting, and all this kind of stuff. But I don't think that they are aware of how they establish trust or processes around it.
How do you do that remotely then?
You're bouncing the question back to me. Okay, fair enough. So I think it's the same problem in an office. Like, that's my honest, strong belief. It's the same problem. You can just monkey patch it and fix it easier in an office because you might just have another meeting, right? And this kind of stuff. But you actually don't solve the root problem. You don't solve, like, this person won't become more autonomous just by adding more micromanagement. So I usually, like, there's two aspects to this. Like, I focus on something which I call single player experience. So the whole goal is that a person can work as much as possible on their own and can make decisions on their own as much as is possible. This requires a lot of discipline and a lot of explicit awareness of the management. You need to be aware roughly where the company goes. You need to be roughly aware what kind of decisions you want to pass on and what not, how you actually make decisions yourself, so that you can teach others how you would make this decision. Like, this is a lot of explicit reflection on yourself that you as a manager need to hand over and pass over. And also, like, on a scale of systemizing trust, figure out where I'm comfortable with which kind of decision, with which kind of person that they do on their own. This is a very reflective, explicit process that you as a manager need to do. I strongly believe you should do this in any team. Doesn't matter remote or not, but in a remote team, it's something that's more in your face.
Don't you think? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, no, please go ahead.
Like, I was gonna get into the whole managing yourself part, but personally, I think that requires a lot of discipline.
Yes.
And you can argue that most people, I was a tutor, I was a teacher. Discipline is a really hard thing, especially in the modern day with all these distractions and stuff. How do you ensure that the workforce that you're hiring remote is disciplined enough to stay on track and do what you need them to do? So
I agree in principle. Humans converge to anything that's easy.
Yeah.
So, anything that we love fast food because it's close by, easy and yummy, right? We could cook a healthy meal, but burger's fine, right? So I agree in principle. Usually, in my experience, you substitute with process. So you basically have an explicit process in place where you know what is expected for the company to function. This is especially important to a remote team. For example, if we agree on, in an engineering team, if we agree on that every morning everybody reviews everybody else's code, then I know I don't need to remind you. And when I will get back up, somebody will have already looked at the code because it was already somebody's morning, If I don't have this explicit agreement, which is a process, I cannot rely on that, and I need to ping you constantly. And with these kind of principles and processes, you establish a routine which substitutes a lot of you still need a certain discipline, but it's not I don't know, a monk in the mid-century discipline of punishing yourself discipline. It's more like having a basic process in place, right? Which you anyway should do in any engineering company, for example.
But that's interesting because you say it's more efficient from a lot of people in the chat are saying, when you work remotely, you have less meetings, you're not pulled into all these extraneous side chats, etc. So it's less distracting, but at the same time, you have more process. And what I've also heard is when you're working remote setting, you have 5 or 10x as much process as if you were just all in the office. And so how do you balance that trade-off? So
I will pass this afterwards to Jeff because he's literally writing a thesis on this topic. But just to add this before, when I think of processes, I don't think of long workflow chains. I don't think this kind of you do something, I do something, this person does something, and then we need a rubber, a stamp from this person, and then we need whatever, right? I'm thinking more explicit agreements. So we agree every morning we do X, right? Like in a lot of co-located teams, like every morning we do a stand-up. Like this is an agreement and this is a process, right? These in place are usually very lightweight, and you want them to be lightweight. You have less meetings, not because people hate meetings. People hate meetings anyway, because a lot of meetings are just like very ineffective and like very badly managed. Meetings are just a little bit more costly to you because a 1 hour hangout is just more draining than a 1 hour in-person discussion, and you need to be by far more focused and all this kind of stuff. So what you end up doing is like somebody actually prepares for the meeting, has notes, maybe shares them before that so people read, has more discipline, who is talking, who is not talking, stay on focus afterwards, like write down what you actually has an agreement and all this kind of stuff. But in the end, this is stuff you want in any meeting, right? So it's not necessarily like a remote specific thing. It's just like something that you're forced on when you do remote. And this is like this thing that becomes like this 5x of complexity. If I'm 5 people in an co-located office, I don't like, hey, let's quickly discuss this and we're done, right? Like I see everybody, like discuss this now, we're done. 5 people remote, like somebody might not be online right now, somebody might not join the meeting. You need to write some notes that they know what's up, or at least you need to leave a Slack message or something like this. So all of a sudden, like 5 people feel like 25 people, 10 people feel like 50 people. And this is roughly where this increased complexity comes from in my experience. That being said, like processes, but not like in this scary sense of like, oh my God, this company has so much bureaucracy, but more like in the sense of explicit agreements, is a good substitute and usually reduces the amount of like ad hoc meetings you need to have.
I'll jump in here and say something really quick. I think I can't be, I mean, I'm sure it's an Arianna problem, but I can't be the only person who has this problem. I have a really hard time paying the degree of attention that I like to pay when I'm remote. Like the phone is the worst. Like if anyone is talking to me on the phone and I capture like 50% of what they said, that's like a good day. Whereas in person, I'm like 100% engaged. And like if let's say I work on this and I get to the point where it's like I capture 70%. That's still a significant kind of downtick from what I would be gathering otherwise. So again, it's my problem for sure, but like I doubt that I'm the only person who has this issue. So I wouldn't be surprised if like especially if you have like a lot of people who are, I don't know, maybe ADD or something, who are creative. And in many cases, those people can be super valuable, but they may have a harder time paying attention as well. So I think that's also something that isn't really discussed much, but is worth considering.
Yeah, on this topic, so I'm friendly with Ryan Holdaway, who's the VP of Outcomes at Lambda School, and they have a requirement now during lectures that you have your video on, because they've seen data and have quantified the idea that their top performing students do have video on and not just they don't just have voice. And so I think it's interesting noting that there is a certain attention that you have to pay when you're on video, and just like academically, that's being proven right now that video is more effective than voice in a learning situation.
But then to that, I would add, can you quantify how much better in person is to video? Like, I don't know what the numbers are, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually better in person.
I didn't pay attention in school. And I have ADHD as fuck. Like,
yeah. No, and then the process thing is interesting because, like, there's a lot of. I agree that you have to be very, very explicit with process if you're remote, just because that's the only way to get stuff done. But that same requirement slows you down to a crawl when you are iterating really fast. Like, there's just times where we just do not even have time to document things because we're just trying it out. And if we had to all document the whole process of decision, and like by the time we made it, we'd probably be too late making that decision or even that iteration. So like it's totally it's totally possible, but again, I think it slows you down to a crawl especially at a startup stage when you need to be super agile and super quick.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to hop off now, but I'll let you guys carry on.
No,
So
I think
thanks so much for
overall-
having me, unless you're wrapping up anyways. So.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up anyway. This was an awesome
Okay.
conversation. I thank you guys for coming online. I'll follow up with the tweet and then we can continue the discussion on Twitter or other places. But thanks for everyone for your thoughts and hope everyone enjoyed it.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much. It was
Bye.
fun.